What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Long Lens Podcast. This is the podcast where I answer questions from my YouTube and filmmaking community, and sometimes I also have guests on the pod, and we talk about all things YouTube and filmmaking. So I hope you all had a great New Year's. I took a little bit of a hiatus during Christmas, and I'm back now, super excited for what's to come in 2025. You may have noticed a new logo for this podcast. I kind of wanted to keep it in the same theme of my main channel's logo. So got a little bit new branding and a little new intro music. So I'm trying to revamp this podcast a little bit in 2025. You may notice I got myself a new microphone, an actual podcasting microphone. This is the Shure MV7, which I really like because I can use it with XLR, which is what you're hearing right now, or I can plug it right into my laptop and use it as a digital mic too, which I really like because this will be good for voiceovers and stuff. So trying to take this podcast a little bit more seriously in 2025. But if this is your first time here, I essentially ask for questions every month and then try to answer them to the best of my abilities. I'm kind of a kook. I don't know everything, but I have been making videos probably since 2004. So I know a little bit, and I just try to answer them as best as I can. And the way that it works is I always answer my Patreon questions first, and I read out your name if you support me on Patreon. So you get a little bit of a shout out, and then I answer my YouTube community question pages. Sometimes I'll even throw in a SpeakPipe message where people can leave me audio messages that I'll play during the podcast. But yeah, without any further ado, this is another Q&A podcast. But before we start, I do want to say that I have a special guest on the next episode, Chris Tellez, who is a professional photographer out of Ontario, Canada. So that's a pretty fun episode. Be sure to stay tuned for that one coming out this month as well. But let's get right into the Patreon questions. And I'm pretty sure we only have one this month. And the only question that we have here on Patreon is from a longtime supporter, Ivan Martinek. And Ivan asks, "Hi Nigel, I own two S5 Mark IIs, but because of the weight and size, I never carry them with me. And I end up not practicing photo and videography. What smaller camera would you recommend as an everyday in the bag camera and lens to practice the craft?" Yeah, that's something that I struggle with too. I struggle with wanting the quality of my bigger cameras, but in a smaller form factor. And for me, it's been Micro Four Thirds for the longest time. This is my GH5 that I have, which honestly rigged out like this, it's not that small, but I love this camera. I also, somewhere around here, I have a GX85, which is a smaller range finder style camera. And that one's great if you just want to take photos. It can shoot video too, but it doesn't have a mic input and there's not really a log profile, even though you can figure out a way to put on Cine D to that camera. Since you have two S5 Mark IIs, something that I would probably recommend, even though every part of me doesn't like this camera, but the more and more I see other people use it and the stuff that they get out of it, the Lumix S9 could be a contender. It's going down in price in the used market, which I'm stoked to see because I think that camera makes way more sense as $1,000 camera as opposed to the initial price, which was $1,400 or $1,500. So the S9 could be a good option since you have two S5 Mark IIs. You probably have a lot of L-mount glass. The S9 could make a lot of sense. It is small, and if you pair it with a smaller lens, like one of the Sigma Primes, you can get away with something that's close to the size of a Micro Four Thirds camera, but still not really. Like a GX85 and a 20mm f1.7 is still going to be smaller than anything that you can get with an S9, unless you're going, weird manual focus, cheap Chinese lens that you're going to slap on the front of an S9, which I see a lot of people doing, but that's just, I'd like to have an autofocus lens if I was going to use a small little camera like that. So until Lumix comes out with a small pancake lens, kind of like that weird plastic, no autofocus one that they released it with, if they could release something that small, but with autofocus and a decently fast aperture, I think that would be the perfect setup. But yeah, unless you're willing to go into a different system like Micro Four Thirds, I would say look at the S9. Thanks a lot for that question, Ivan. I feel like that's a question that I'm kind of struggling with right now is because I do have two systems. I have a GH5, a GX85, and an S5 Mark II X. I'm always kind of questioning what system I should really be investing a lot in. And that was all the questions from Patreon. Thanks to everyone who supports me on Patreon. If you would like to, there'll be links in the show notes and the description of this video. So we have 10 here on the YouTube community page. And the first one is, please, please, please make a video about this rig. And I think they're talking about this rig, which I posted a picture of this GH5 rig at the beginning of the month to ask for questions. Not specifically about this rig, but I always just post a picture to tell my community that I'm taking questions. I might make a full video on this rig. I'm not really sure. This is a hacked apart GH5 small rig cage that I turned into a half cage. I have this D style handle on here, which is something I found on AliExpress because my buddy Cole over at Alt Cine put me onto this. So it's kind of like this cheap handle that is all metal and it's really good. I've got a small HD Focus 5 on here, and I got this monitor specifically because with a couple of menu changes on the GH5, you can make the HDMI signal actually trigger a red frame around the small HD Focus 5, which is kind of like, like a tally light, just like you would see it on the S5 Mark II X. So even though the GH5 doesn't have it on its screen, I'll see a red frame up here, which is pretty cool. It's got a little metal small rig ball joint mount here on the top of the handle, so I can kind of like maneuver it wherever I want to. And my Comica VM10 is right here connected to a little 15 millimeter rod. I'm sorry for all of the audio listeners. If you want to see this rig, go watch the video version of this podcast. And then I just have this little pigtail HDMI thing, which is just makes it easy that I can just unplug my HDMI cable from the camera. I unscrew this thumb screw and then unplug the mic. And then this is kind of like the audio video top handle, and I can just go really, really bare bones with the GH5. So that's the rig. I did a whole video about how I hacked together this half cage because I hate full cages on the GH5. All of them kind of suck. I just bought a full cage for my S5 IIX, which is the Black Mamba cage, which I think is the best version of a full cage that I've ever used. So that's just kind of how I have rigged this GH5 together. And I can use this top handle on my S5 IIX as well. So everything I can just kind of switch this top handle setup from camera to camera, which is pretty nice. All right, the next question is general overview of your YouTube video creation process from title, scripting, storyboard, filming, editing, perhaps a main channel video due to the scope. Yeah, I don't know if I have a main channel video planned around that subject, but I can tell you that I do try to think of a title for the video before I start filming. That's kind of like a trick that a lot of bigger YouTubers do, is they don't start making a video and then figure out a title as they're making it. Sometimes that does happen. Sometimes I think of a title, start making the video, and then as I'm making the video, I think of a better title. That happens all the time, but I typically try to have an idea before I go into actually making the video. So scripting, I kind of write my scripts out like an essay, just in paragraphs. And sometimes I'll even split up the paragraphs even more because I know that I'm going to deliver one sentence at a time or a few sentences at a time to camera. I never use a teleprompter. Editing, I mean, I could show people how I edit, but I feel like editing is kind of like painting. You can't teach somebody to be a painter, really. You can probably teach them about the different brushes and different techniques, but really, painting something is like, it's an artistic expression. That's kind of how I feel about editing. I edit in Adobe Premiere Pro still, even though everyone's telling me to switch to DaVinci. I feel like the more people tell me to switch, the more my stubbornness kicks in and I just want to use Adobe even more. It still works perfectly for me. I haven't had a single issue. I talk about this a lot. Ever since switching to Apple Silicon, I haven't had a single issue with Adobe Premiere. Storyboards, I never make storyboards for my YouTube videos. Maybe for like client videos or spec ads, I'll make a storyboard for it. But for my YouTube videos, I just kind of know what I'm going to need to shoot. Yeah, I might make a full video about that. If you would like to see and hear more about how I make my videos, you can leave that in the comment section as a suggestion of what I should do. But yeah, that hasn't really been top priority. I have been thinking about making a video on my office because I'll probably be in this office for another 10 months or so until I move. My wife and I are probably going to move at the end of 2025. But if you'd like to see a tour of my office, that might be something that I could show you just as a little sneak peek into like my video creation area. The next question isn't really a question. They say no questions yet, but after being subscribed to your channel on here as my other account, and because the single account I subscribe to on Patreon is now on hiatus, I have no problem taking monthly subscription over to your Patreon now. I enjoy your videos, even though I make narrative shorts, because I also use Micro Four Thirds and I'm cheap, so I'm on a budget. Your videos are very good for me. Keep it up. Thanks a lot. I appreciate the encouragement, and I'm glad my videos have been entertaining for you, even though they're not exactly the type of stuff that you make. The next question is, how did you practice editing before you started taking on clients? When I started taking on clients back in like my early 20s, my editing skills were already okay because I'd been making so many videos that weren't for clients beforehand. And that's what I would probably say is that, like, you know, obviously you're not going to take on a client if you don't really know how to edit first, especially if they're expecting editing from you. So just like you know, wouldn't go and shoot a paid gig on a camera that you've never used before, don't accept a client job if you aren't actually confident in what you're doing. So yeah, I had made hundreds of videos before I took on my first client, so I knew that I could edit it well. I think my first paid client was a wedding client, so I had watched enough wedding videos to know how they're supposed to flow and what they're supposed to look like, and I knew that I could edit one together. So whatever client you're taking on, if you've never edited that before, I would say watch as much of that style of content as you can so you can kind of understand the flow of what type of video you're trying to make. Next question is the GH7 on the picture, and what do you think about it? No, in that picture, again, was my GH5 rigged out, just like how I had mentioned earlier. I think the GH7 is sick, but it is kind of a hard sell against my S5 2X, especially for the stuff that I do. Right now, I'm using autofocus, which is great. The GH7 also has autofocus. But the thing is, like, even getting a shot like this on a GH7, I could, but you know, with the background separation and the exposure and all that type of stuff, it's just easier a lot of times on a full frame camera than it would be on like a GH7. On a GH7, I would need that 10 to 25 f1.7, which is a pretty expensive lens. I have a $600 lens on my S5 2X. It's probably even cheaper now, the 28 to 70. Lensing, I feel like, is the one thing that full frame has over Micro Four Thirds. To get the equivalent background separation and light gathering on a Micro Four Thirds, it just takes a much more expensive lens than it would on a full frame. On a full frame camera, I can throw a 50 millimeter f1.7 vintage lens on there, and it's going to give me good light capturing capabilities, good background separation. But to do the equivalent on a Micro Four Thirds camera, you would either need like a 25 mil 0.95 lens or something, or you would need Lumix Leica or Olympus Pro lens to get a similar style of look. So that's why I would say it's a hard sell for Micro Four Thirds unless you need the specific features that the GH7 has. The RE log, the faster readout speed, which again is why I have the GH5, is because this has a faster readout speed than my S5 2X. The S5 2X in full frame mode is like 22 milliseconds. This guy is like 13 or 15 seconds or something like that. So a lot faster. That's why people use these for filming action sports a lot of the times, is because these just have faster readout speeds. So you'd have to do a lot more research. I can't really say if the GH7 is right for you or not, because it really depends on what you're shooting, which I know is a cop-out answer, but really I think that should be the first question before you ever ask about what camera you should get. It's, what are you shooting primarily? You know, if you're shooting a bunch of action, snowboarding, skateboarding, stuff where you're going to be doing a lot of whip pans, I think the readout speed is something that you should take into consideration. You will notice it. Will clients notice it? Will the audience notice it? That is, you can argue maybe they wouldn't, but if that's something that's going to bother you, then that's something that you should, take into consideration. But yeah, the GH7 is pretty much great in every regard, except for the fact that if you want to get shallow depth of field easily and cheaply, it's a little harder. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, next question is, hi Nigel, I always watch your videos about the G7 and G85. I was thinking about buying either. What do you recommend going into 2025? Thank you. So fun fact, I've never owned the G7, and I don't think I've ever made a video on the G7, but you may have confused it with the G85, which I have made plenty of videos on. I've loved that camera. I love Micro Four Thirds for the size and the quality and the price. The price to performance ratio on Micro Four Thirds is great. If you wanted to stick in the Micro Four Thirds, I actually would say save up a little bit of extra money and buy a GH5 instead. You'll be way happier. But let's just pretend that a GH5 is $500 used. I've seen the original S5 for like 750 in the used market. That's something that you can consider as well. The original S5 is amazing. The only real drawback is the 30-minute record limit in 4K. 1080p, I think you can record for as long as you want. But again, if you got an original S5, you can literally just go on eBay, find some cheap vintage lenses, get a cheap adapter, and you can build out an entire set. Whereas with a GH5, if you want to try to use vintage lenses, if you want usable footage out of vintage lenses, you're going to need a speed booster, which is going to be an extra cost. So yeah, I mean, that's just something to consider. I love the GH5 and you can do a lot with it. So if you wanted to stay in Micro Four Thirds, this is going to make you a lot happier, I think, than a G7 or a G85. I love both of those cameras and they're great, but the price difference between a G85 and a GH5 is small enough to where it's just like, if you just save up a couple extra $100, you can get this camera, which can still produce footage that can match easily with my S5 IIX. So that's what I would say. All right, this next question is kind of in the same vein, GH5 in 2025. I would say absolutely. This camera can be a perfect first camera for anyone trying to get into filmmaking. It could be a great B camera for anyone who maybe has a GH7 or a GH6 or even the new G9 Mark II. This could be a great, secondary body to have. You can shoot open gate with this 4x3. You can shoot a bunch of different types of 4K 10-bit 422. So this camera is great. Yeah, the only thing that you're going to find lacking is low light and autofocus. Those are the only two things. Other than that, it's amazing. Great image stabilization, fast readout speed. I mean, fast enough. This isn't like A7S3 readout speed, but it's like, again, I think it's either 13 or 15 seconds in 4K. So love this camera. The GH5 is great. It produced amazing footage in 2017, and it'll continue to produce amazing footage for many years to come. All right, this next question is actually from a former podcast guest, Matthew Dangu, and he was asking, which camera ecosystem are you going all in on this year? And Matthew is actually referring to a post that I did on Instagram, which if you're not following me on Instagram, you can find me at Nigel Bajos. And I put out a poll asking people what system I should go all in on in 2025. And the options were L-mount, Micro Four Thirds, Fuji X, or Sony E. And in case anyone was wondering, the poll that won was Micro Four Thirds at 31%. I think the best answer that I saw from that post on Instagram is from my buddy Jake Felzine. And he said, the right answer is Sony, the fun answer is Fuji, the smart answer is L-mount, and the goated answer is Micro Four Thirds, which I couldn't agree more. In the area and industry that I'm in, here in Portland, everybody shoots on Sony, so that would be the smart choice. I could probably get a lot more cam op jobs if I shot Sony. Fuji would definitely be fun because a lot of the photographers here in Portland shoot Fuji. L-mount would be the smart choice because this camera that I'm shooting on is making me the most money in my freelance career because I use this for client work and not my GH5. But yeah, I would agree the goated answer would be to just stick with Micro Four Thirds and just shoot this all year. I can't say that I'm going to do that because when I do get client jobs, I prefer the reliability of the autofocus on my S5 IIX, and my clients really like how the full frame looks. Not that I really think that they would care if I shot Micro Four Thirds, but when I'm charging a lot of money for video work, I want it to look as good as it possibly can, and it's just easier on the S5 IIX. Not saying anything bad about Micro Four Thirds, but clients are very happy with the footage that they see out of my S5 IIX, so that's the one that I typically would go towards. I'm still on the fence though. I don't know if I'm gonna just kind of say goodbye to Micro Four Thirds or say goodbye to the L mount. I'm still kind of on the fence. I'm sure I'll let you guys know which path I've decided to go down in the near future. All right, next question. Hey Nigel, Happy New Year. I want to pursue more YouTube this year, and my aim is one video per week. Do you have any tips on how to maintain momentum and speak confidently on camera? One video a week is definitely a good schedule to keep on. I definitely think that keeping your momentum is something that happens when you're stoked on each video that you make. So I would just say, as soon as you start not liking the videos that you make because you're keeping yourself on a strict one video per week schedule, that's when I think that you should maybe slow it down to 2 videos a month. As long as you're happy with the videos that you're making, even if they're not getting a lot of views, if you're proud of the videos that you make, those are the ones, like, that's what's going to keep you motivated to keep on making them, not necessarily just view count. Because I feel a lot of people, they keep themselves on that one video per week schedule, and then they end up making like filler videos a lot because they don't have any like big ideas or, you know, bigger, more thought out videos to make. And so they start making those filler videos. They're not as stoked on those, and they just get burnt out and they stop. So that's what I would say is the one video a week model is great, but if you can't keep that up, don't give yourself a hard time. Just give yourself some grace and, you know, cut it back to 2 videos a month if you have to. And I guess it really depends on the style of video that you're making. For me, a lot of my videos take longer than a week to make, so I can't pump them out every single week, but 2 videos a month is what I'm trying to stick to. So at least on my main channel. My second channel, I can just kind of throw anything on this channel and it doesn't feel I don't feel a lot of pressure because this channel is still small enough that like I'm not really like, I don't care if I get a lot of views here. I'm not making really any money on this channel. So yeah, it just kind of depends on like what your goals are for YouTube. But I find that people burn out a lot quicker when they keep themselves on those strict schedules, and then they just can't get out of that cycle of just making constant filler videos that are just kind of like quick, low effort videos that don't get any views. And once you start doing too many of those, then it's pretty easy to get burnt out. All right, so next question is, I've owned the GH3 for the past 3 years. Thanks to your videos, I've learned the basics of the camera and cinematography and the small file sizes, and the quality of the all-eye codec is great for someone who can't afford many SSDs and who is a college student. I'm considering investing in a gimbal like the Ronin SC and or stabilized lens like the 12-35, or grabbing a GH5, G9, or G85 as my work requires movement for recap videos and photos for my church. And creating short films sometimes is difficult to get smooth handheld shots since the GH3 doesn't have IBIS. What would you say is the best way to go about this? And I'm a college student working part-time. Other than that, this camera was cheap and is still excellent for my use. Yeah, so I think that there's 3 ways that you can go about this, like 3 tiers of like how much money you want to spend. So the cheapest thing to do would probably be to buy the DJI Ronin SC. I think you can get this for like $150 in the used market a lot of the times. And that's great because you can use it with almost any camera that fits the weight restrictions of that gimbal. I bought that back around when it first came out, and I haven't felt the need to buy another gimbal because all gimbals pretty much work the same way. Some of them have different, you know, bells and whistles and different weight capacities, but for the GH3, the Ronin SC is great. The next step up would probably be lens. So you could get the Lumix 42.5 f1.7, which will let in like a good amount of light at f1.7, and it's a stabilized prime lens, which is pretty rare. There's only like a handful of lenses that are prime stabilized lenses. So that could be an option if you're okay with, you know, stepping a little bit further back and, you know, getting more tighter shots, because that's about an 85 millimeter equivalent field of view on Micro Four Thirds. And then you could go up in price a little bit. I think that prime lens is like $200 in the used market, maybe. And then the 12-35 is probably around $300, at least the version 1. The one that I have is the version 2, which is essentially the same thing, just a little bit better coatings on this one, I think. And then the more expensive option would be to upgrade your camera body to a stabilized sensor, like the GH5, the G9, or the G85 are obviously 3 of the ones that you're considering. The G85 would be the cheapest, but just like I told the last person, I think that if you're going to save up for a G85, save up a little bit more and just buy the GH5. The GH5, again, you could use for the next 5 years, and I'm sure your clients will be happy with it. Those are the 3 different things I would do. I would say just pick the one that makes sense for you financially right now. And yeah, I'm glad that you like the GH3. The GH3 is still such a goated camera. I love how good that image can still look even now in 2025. And I'm glad that you're getting use out of it. That's awesome. So those are all the questions for this episode of the Long Lens Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, stay tuned for the next episode coming out soon with Chris Tellez, and we're going to have some more guests on this podcast in 2025. Mark my words. But anyways, thank you so much to everyone who submitted a question, and I'll see you guys soon. Later.